If I'm being honest, I'm wearing this just because the movie's about Bigfoot. Like, Chewbacca is the closest thing I have to Bigfoot. Okay? I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do. Also, I've had this onesie for like 8 years, I think 9 years actually. I've had it since like The Force Awakens came out, so that's fun. Anyway, let's jump into the movie. Hey everyone. Let me get this thing off. Uh, I was going to do a Chewbacca mom bit for this, so be thankful I didn't. Anyway, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, I have something to address here with you guys real quick. I feel personally that I have not been living up to the edict of my channel. The whole reason I started Underground Cinema was to cover movies that society forgot about. Indie films that didn't receive a wide distribution, character dramas that didn't really find their audience, or B movies that just came and went. And lately, with the films I've been covering, I don't feel like I've been living up to that expectation that I set for myself at the beginning. Obviously, I don't want to limit myself. There's all sorts of films that I'm interested in talking about and covering. But most of the movies that I've reviewed lately, while not insanely popular, do have an audience that have followed them since their initial release. So from this point forth, while I'll still be covering all sorts of films, I want to recenter my focus on what my original intention was. So what better way to refocus myself on the indie films, character dramas, and B movies than by talking about a film that is all three? So this week, we'll be talking about the Canadian Cryptid Comedy, Drawing Flies, from 1996. Now, Drawing Flies has a pretty interesting production history. I touched on this history briefly when I was reviewing the movie Mallrats, but the way that this film was made is that it started off as an idea from two friends, Matt Gissing and Malcolm Ingram. The two friends penned a script together in 1991 that centered around 5 friends living off of welfare in Canada. And while the two men had the desire to make the movie, neither of them really had the means at that point. That is, until 1994, when Clerks came out. You see, Clerks was the first film from pop culture icon Kevin Smith. And after the film's enormous success from the indie film scene, Kevin Smith ended up getting brought on by Universal to make his second film, Mallrats. And while Mallrats was being made, the production was paid a visit by Malcolm Ingram, who at the time was working as a film journalist for the indie film magazine Film Threat, which is actually still in operation. In fact, I think that the current head editor of Film Threat is actually film critic Chris Gore, who I've actually met. Very interesting film critic, that man. In any case, Ingram visited the set of Mallrats to see what the up-and-coming indie director Kevin Smith was up to next. And while he was on the set of the film, he not only developed a very close friendship with Kevin Smith, but many other members of the cast and crew. And these relationships that Ingram forged with all these people are what inevitably enabled him to go and make the film that him and his friend Matt Gissing had conceptualized nearly half a decade earlier. So, in 1995, while Mallrats was in post-production getting ready to be released, Ingram ended up taking a lot of the cast of Mallrats up to Canada to work on his film with Matt Gissing. And that project would become Drawing Flies. And what's really interesting about Drawing Flies as a film is that in addition to featuring a lot of the cast of Mallrats, the movie itself also has Kevin Smith attached to it as a producer, which made Drawing Flies the first film Kevin Smith ever produced without directing. Not only that, but Drawing Flies was also the first film to ever be produced by Kevin Smith's production company, Askew, without also being directed by him. So with these varying elements of a shared cast and some shared crew members, many people consider Drawing Flies to be the lost View Askew film, or as I like to call it, the forgotten film of the Askewniverse, being Kevin Smith's American Northeast Cinematic Universe. Now, obviously, featuring a lot of the same cast and crew does not automatically make a film part of a cinematic universe. If anything, those elements would just make a project a spiritual sequel or reunion film. And Kevin Smith kind of acknowledges this, that Drawing Flies is kind of like a quasi-sequel or spiritual sequel to Mallrats. So in order for Drawing Flies to actually fit into the Askewniverse as a cinematic universe, there would actually need to be some connective tissue like shared characters. Well, here's the thing. Drawing Flies actually does have shared characters with the rest of the Askewniverse, which I will get into later in this review. But with all this setup out of the way, what actually happens in the movie Drawing Flies? Well, similarly to Mallrats, Drawing Flies actually opens up with narration from Jason Lee. However, unlike Mallrats, where the opening narration is meant to set the comedic tone of that film, the opening narration in Drawing Flies is meant to set up the overall somberness of the main character and how he feels like he's in a rut in his life. After this narration ends, we meet our 5 central characters in the film, being Donner, played by Jason Lee, Meg, played by Renee Humphrey, Az, played by Jason Mewes, Cassidy, played by Carmen Lee, also known as Carmen Llewellyn, and Jake, played by Martin Brooks. And interestingly enough, this is actually Martin Brooks' only film appearance. Apparently Brooks was just a friend of Malcolm Ingram. Ingram asked him to be in this film. He was never in a film before this, and to my knowledge, he's never done another film after. And considering all that, I think he actually does a really good job in this movie, like pretty much everyone else. But I'll get more into the performances later. But at the beginning of the film, our 5 central characters are sitting in a welfare office waiting to get their monthly checks. And also, interesting side note, the welfare office lady in the beginning of the film is actually played by Gloria Ingram, Malcolm Ingram's mother. Which, that's just a fun hallmark of so many indie films. The fact that they're so low budget, the cast and crew often get family members and friends just to participate in the film as extras or side characters. I mean, Kevin Smith himself did that in his first film, Clerks, bringing in his mother to play a character called the Milkmaid, who's looking for the perfect gallon of milk. Anyway, as we go through each of their interviews with the welfare lady, we find out that all of them, except for Jake, have had their welfare revoked, which has obviously screwed all of them over because they're already $200 behind on their last month's rent, and now they don't even have money to pay this month's rent. And you can assume, based on context, that since they are 5 roommates and only one of them got a welfare check, the check being for $530, they're screwed. Following their disappointment at the welfare office, the 5 roommates go walk the streets of Vancouver, Canada, and they're just looking for something to do. They come across a party, and they're told by the 2 girls at the front that there's an entry fee of $10 each because they can't pay their rent either because they were also cut off welfare. And this is actually quite an interesting detail that's communicated to us, because what it implies in the world of this film is that perhaps the Canadian government is actually finally cracking down on welfare and the distribution of funds to, lazy assholes in their early 20s. And something else interesting I'd like to bring up is that of the 2 girls that are outside asking for the $10 entry fee, one of those girls is actually played by Kristen Mosier, the sister of Scott Mosier, Kevin Smith's longtime producing partner. And her appearance in Drawing Flies would make it the 2nd appearance that she has in a View Askew production. Her first appearance being the comic book girl extra in Mallrats. Anyway, the 5 roommates are bored, so they all make Jake pay the entrance fee for them. They go into the party, and I'll be very frank about this up front. The party scene in this movie is the best scene in the movie. Not only does it help build our understanding of these characters and how they interact socially day to day, but it's also an incredibly entertaining scene and really highlights the subtle sense of humor that this film has, as many of the jokes throughout this party sequence are either physical, situational, or just plain inside jokes. Some examples I noticed of these types of jokes in this sequence would be like how there's a cameo from the film's directors, Malcolm Ingram and Matt Gissing. And funny enough, Malcolm Ingram in this shot is actually wearing a Film Threat t-shirt, because obviously at the time he worked for Film Threat. And you know, it's funny with Malcolm Ingram wearing a Film Threat shirt in this movie, it sort of goes along with like the subtle product placements that you see in various View Askew films. Like how in Mallrats you see that Walt Flanagan's character Fanboy is wearing a View Askew jersey. Yeah, I just love stuff like that. But during the cameo scene that they get, they're being insulted for their music taste by Jason Mewes. And the reason this scene is funny is because obviously, as the directors of the film, they handpicked all the songs in this movie. And in fact, I think one of the lines that Ingram says in his cameo is that he's a fan of grunge, and most of the songs in the movie are from Canadian indie grunge bands. So the fact that Mewes is insulting their music taste is just a funny inside joke. And also, as a side note, I'd like to bring up this interesting piece of trivia, being that the film's title, Drawing Flies, is actually taken from a song called Drawing Flies by the band Soundgarden. And they apparently wanted to use that song for this movie, but after giving it some consideration, they realized it wouldn't be feasible because the song was too popular for them to use. I think the way Malcolm Ingram puts it is that it wouldn't make sense to put a song in the movie that was worth more than the movie, which is kind of similar to the conflict that Kevin Smith faced directing the music video for Can't Even Tell by Soul Asylum. It's like, I can't film a music video for a higher budget than the movie cost? That doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's one joke I noticed. Another joke I noticed that I thought was pretty funny. It's a subtle physical joke, and the camera doesn't draw attention to it at all. You have to notice it. It's a wide frame shot where you see Jason Mewes' character as flirting with a bar girl. The bar girl in question being played by the wife of the then editor of Film Threat, whatever his name was. I'll put it up here. But while Az is flirting with her, you actually can see off to the side that Jason Lee's character Donner is subtly stealing beer from the bar. The whole scene is really just a misdirection. And it's just such a subtle moment, and it's so funny because the film does not draw attention to it at all. It's just something that happens. And another nice little visual joke I noticed during the party sequence, and it was kind of a blink and you'll miss it moment, is that during a shot where you see the characters of Meg and Jake dancing together, you can see that there's a blonde girl in a dress dancing off to the side, inching herself closer to them. And if you look closely, the blonde girl is just Jason Mewes in a dress with pigtails. And it's just such a short shot, you'd have to pay attention to notice it was him. But immediately following that shot, you get probably like the funniest inside joke interaction in the movie, and it also firmly connects this film to the View Askewniverse, being that you see a shot of Jason Mewes as bump into Kevin Smith, who is dressed as Silent Bob. Now, this sequence is funny for a variety of reasons. Like, it's funny in universe because these two characters would have beef with each other. As we see earlier during the party sequence, Jason Mewes' character is flirting with a hippie chick played by Joey Lauren Adams, and he points to Silent Bob as the bassist of a band that he manages. And when Jason Mewes' character points that out, the hippie chick immediately abandons him and goes to Silent Bob. And that would explain why the two characters give each other disgusted looks after they, run into each other. So that's why it's funny in universe. But out of universe, it's funny for a couple other reasons. One, because like I said, the hippie chick is played by Joey Lauren Adams, and her choosing Silent Bob over Az is literally her choosing her boyfriend over this guy, because in real life, at the time, Joey Lauren Adams was dating Kevin Smith. So that would be another reason why this is funny. But the most obvious reason why this is funny is because you have the actors that play Jay and Silent Bob, respectively, run into each other and then just go the other way because they don't like seeing each other. It's just an overall funny interaction, and obviously Silent Bob's appearance in this movie does provide a steady link between this film and the other films in the View Askewniverse. Because obviously the through line of most of the View Askewniverse films is the appearances of the characters Jay and Silent Bob. Obviously in this film, it's just Silent Bob. Jason Mewes is playing a different character who is not Jay. But nevertheless, the connection exists. Also, funny enough, this is like the only project that features the character of Silent Bob without the character of Jay. That's just interesting, fundamentally. And many people might say, okay, fine, Silent Bob appears in this movie. Jay and Silent Bob appear in a lot of movies that aren't part of the Askewniverse, like Scream 3, for instance. Well, here's the thing. In the party sequence, you also have another character show up, played by Ethan Suplee. And in the context of this film, the character that Ethan Suplee plays is supposed to be the ex-boyfriend of the character Meg, Renee Humphrey's character. But that character is Willem Black from Mallrats, the character that he played in Mallrats. Although there is kind of an interesting inconsistency with Ethan Supplee's appearance, because in the movie they refer to him as Ethan. They refer to his character as Ethan. But in the film's credits, they credit him as Willem Black, which was his character in Mallrats. But they also credit Silent Bob as himself in this movie, and they also call Silent Bob John through dialogue, although that's probably just the character of as bullshitting. All I'm saying is that, no matter how you slice it, that character that they call Ethan is probably Willem Black. And, I think they say in one of the film commentaries for this movie that the reason why Ethan Suplee was credited as Willem Black in this movie was so that he could stay out of trouble with the Screen Actors Guild. But, bottom line, it says Willem Black in the credits. And, maybe I'm just thinking about it too hard. Maybe it's just the Willem of Two Worlds theory again. All I'm saying is that if you're looking for Askewniverse connections, here they are. Anyway, after the party scene, the next day rolls around, and we see that the roommates are back at their apartment getting a visit from their local drug dealer, whose name, funny enough, is Ben. Isn't that great? And Ben is there to sell the main characters some Nigerian weed, which is another funny coincidence because I'm actually a Nigerian American. Like, that's not a joke. My father's a Nigerian immigrant. So, it's just kind of a funny thing that there's a drug dealer character in this movie named Ben, and he's selling Nigerian weed to the main characters. It's just odd coincidence. But anyway, he's selling them some weed, and he's selling them the weed at a markup. He says it's a seller's market, so he's selling them like a dime bag for $120. It's ridiculous. Like, patently ridiculous. But they're desperate for the pot. So Cassidy reaches over to Jake's bag and pulls out some of his welfare money to pay for it while he's sleeping. And Meg, who is Jake's girlfriend in this movie, sees the whole thing and does nothing about it. Like, she protests slightly, but makes no effort to stop Cassidy. And by the time Jake wakes up, he's like, oh man, how did I spend $300 without even realizing it? You didn't. You spent 180 tops, and then the other 120 was stolen by one of your roommates, who proceeds to mock him. Which, just shows that Jake's character in this film is kind of like the punching bag. It's ironic that his girlfriend is named Meg rather than him, because Meg from Family Guy. But, going back to the drug dealer Ben for a second, I just find it ridiculous. $120 for a dime bag of weed in the mid-90s? Seriously? Like, that's ridiculous. And also, in the scene, the girls are, like, overtly flirting with Ben because, obviously they're trying to get, like, a markdown on the weed. Like, if I'm Ben in that situation and I have two hot girls begging me for weed, I am totally... Anyway, Jake only has $230 left of his welfare, and the other four roommates are completely broke. They have no idea what to do, but then they remember that the girls from last night who threw the party threw it specifically to pay their rent. That's why they were charging $10 entry per person. So they figured, why can't they do the same thing? So they go out, and with Jake's remaining $230, they go and buy like 2 or 3 kegs of beer. That way they can throw a party. And it's also funny because during this sequence, you can see that Jake's character is wearing like a film center shirt, which I can only assume also belonged to Malcolm Ingram. I like the little references like that. Anyway, the roommates are really excited to plan this party, but you can also see that in the background of scenes that the character Donner is becoming progressively more agitated. Like, he was already sort of fed up with his dead-end life earlier in the movie, but now he's getting to a point where he's just ready to explode because all of his roommates are worthless. I mean, they're all basically NEETs, not in education, employment, or training. And as we see almost immediately in this film, Donner's frustrations are warranted as the beer kegs are immediately stolen out of the team's van. So now the roommates have no means of throwing a party, and they have no money, and they're probably about to be evicted. Things are in dire straits for them. But then we see, one night, Donner is sitting in front of the TV, and he's watching a $6 Million Man marathon. And the episode he's watching specifically is supposed to be a Bigfoot episode. But as all of his roommates go to sleep, he sits there in front of the TV, And as he's sitting on the couch, we see the camera slowly pan to a vision of a Sasquatch. Is this vision brought on by his drug abuse? You know, he probably just did a bunch of pot. Is it brought on by the fact that he's really tired and getting ready to go to sleep? Is it brought on by his desire for something more in life? It's unclear. But he sees a vision of Bigfoot out in the forest. And the day after this vision, he pitches to all of his roommates that they should go camping. And he says to them, oh, well, we could get evicted any day now, and my uncle has a cabin in the woods that we can hang out at. Figure out what we can do next with our lives. So the team begin driving out into the forest of British Columbia. And it's actually funny, because we see as they drive down the highway, they punk a couple hitchhikers and trick them into thinking they'll pick them up when they really aren't. And one of those hitchhikers, the one that flips them the bird, is played by the Canadian film director Bruce McDonald, who in Canada had a local reputation of being the king of the road. I have no idea why he had that reputation. Presumably it's because he directed a movie called Roadkill in 1989. But it's interesting, as Malcolm Ingram and Matt Gissing acknowledge in the film commentary, that Bruce McDonald flipping the bird to our main characters is sort of meant to be like an omen to our main characters. It's supposed to be a sign of misfortune from the king of the road. But anyway, our main characters make it to the forest and they end up wandering around for about 2 weeks. And we see that 4 of the 5 of them are spending their time out in the forest bonding with each other. Getting back to nature, decompressing from all the stress of modern life, taking the time to think about their lives, reflect on their living situations, and overall just having a really fun time with each other. However, while the 4 of them are doing all of this character growth, the 5th roommate, Donner, is having his mind slowly unravel, as obsession is beginning to take him over. And this is actually communicated to us visually in the film, as we see over the course of the 2 weeks that they're in the forest, while the 4 other roommates stay relatively clean despite their current living situation. Donner is getting filthier and filthier, as if he's becoming part of the environment. And obviously the roommates are becoming concerned as they begin to notice the increasingly erratic behavior of Donner. And as their adventure in the forest continues, the roommates begin facing various sorts of misfortune. They end up having to abandon their van to go deeper into the forest. The character of Az ends up falling out of a tree and badly hurting his arm. And then they have a run-in with literal angry man babies, who are also obsessed with Braveheart apparently. Now, after these various obstacles that our characters have gone through, they finally choose to confront Donner about how far they are from his uncle's cabin. And we then get the reveal from Donner that, very obviously, he was lying the whole time. That his uncle actually doesn't have a cabin out here in the forest. He says to his roommates that the reason he brought them out to the forest is because Vancouver was a dead end, that their lives were no longer sustainable, and that they just needed to move on. However, this really isn't the full truth of the matter. And as they continue digging into him, he finally concedes and reveals to all of them that the reason he brought them out there was to search for Bigfoot. And he's a real Bigfoot enthusiast because he insists on calling Bigfoot Sasquatch. That's how you know he's a real one. Everyone is obviously very upset, and at this point, Cassidy chooses to leave Donner and bring Az with her, to get his injured arm treated. Meanwhile, Meg and Jake stay behind for a bit to see if they can get Donner to come to his senses. But really, in staying with Donner and indulging him, they're not really helping him, they're actually enabling him. And at a certain point, they realize that they need to leave as well. We then get a beautiful goodbye scene between Jake and Donner, as Jake tells Donner, hey, I need to take Meg and go. And Donner just says he understands. Despite all his erratic behavior and his rage, he is incredibly understanding that his friends just aren't cut out for the journey that he's set himself on. So they part on amicable terms. We then pivot 2 weeks, maybe even months later, to a party at the same warehouse as the party earlier in the movie. And at this party, we see Meg meet up with Cassidy for the first time since they left the forest. They catch up with each other, and it's revealed to the audience that all the characters have finally started to put their lives together and pursue careers, going down good paths. Apparently, Az has become a telemarketer. Cassidy got a part-time job at the local pet store. Jake got his job back at the museum. And Meg is just trying to scrounge up some money, that way she can leave Vancouver and head to Toronto. The only lingering thread left is Donner. And as the girls go their separate ways, we get one final shot at the party of Meg lying under a table, crying. because Donner's gone. Or is he? The final scene we get in the movie is of Donner sitting out in the forest, completely cleaned up. And he's talking about how his friends are still probably living pathetic and useless lives, just going to parties, getting high, getting drunk, and how pathetic that lifestyle really is, and how he's really found where he's meant to be. And as the camera pans out, we see that he is sitting with a tribe of Sasquatches, about 4 of them. And you can read from this situation that these 4 Sasquatches have taken the places of his 4 friends that he pushed away. And the film just ends. It's an amazing ending. It's very ambiguous. And it's actually so interpretable that the directors themselves actually disagree on what the ending of the film actually means. I believe Malcolm Ingram subscribes to the idea that the end of the movie is supposed to be a final fever dream that Donner's having as he's freezing to death out in the forest. Meanwhile, Matt Gissing is of the opinion that the ending is purely interpretable, and that you could read it as either Donner in the afterlife, or that Donner actually did find the Sasquatches that he was looking for. And the great thing about really any interpretation that you have about this ending is that it doesn't matter what the ending means, because regardless of the interpretation, the central theme and message of the film is maintained, being that at a certain point, you have to stop letting your life happen to you and start leading it for yourself. Like, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but the entire film is about this concept of stagnation, and how at a certain point, when you've hit a dead end, you just need to find another direction to go. But yeah, Drawing Flies. This is a very interesting film for me, in the sense that I probably would have never watched it, or even bought it, on DVD, if it wasn't a View Askew production. But I don't regret watching the movie at all. I really enjoy it. But here's the thing, I don't love it. I like the film, but I don't love it. Obviously, this was a directorial debut from 2 separate co-directors, and while I think a lot of elements of this film are very impressive, there's some things that don't really work, and you can really chalk that up to lack of experience. But before I get into the negatives, let me highlight what I think is genuinely great about this film. First thing to note is that, like many indie films, this movie feels very authentic. All of the dialogue feels natural as opposed to feeling artificial. All the characters are incredibly relatable, as they're, just a bunch of losers in their early to mid-20s. And all of the performances in this film are fantastic. Like I mentioned earlier, this is Martin Brooks' only film, and he does an amazing job in this movie. Renee Humphreys does an amazing job as well. Like I've said in my Mallrats review, I think she's great in that film, but she's even better in Drawing Flies. And what's astounding about her performance is that you can fully believe that her character is in love with the character of Jake. And I think that's notable to bring up because, as according to Renee Humphreys herself, she had absolutely no feelings for Martin Brooks whatsoever. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but watching them in this movie, you can really believe that they are like a lovey-dovey couple. Just based on the level of intimacy the characters share in various scenes, through dialogue, through actions. Even the kisses feel passionate. And, Renee Humphreys didn't feel a damn thing, apparently. Yeah. Also, side note, apparently Martin Brooks kept on getting random erections in this movie. There's various scenes where you can see him covering his crotch because of that, which is hilarious. But yeah, Renee Humphreys is great. Jason Mewes is surprisingly good in this movie. Jason Mewes has spent most of his career playing just one character, Jay, and the character Jay from the Jay and Silent Bob duo is just a more exaggerated version of Jason Mewes. When Jason Mewes plays Jay, he's just playing a heightened version of himself. But in this movie, while the character Az is still a shit-talker, he's a much more subtle and realistic character. He's not going around saying snoochie boochies or doing random dances. He's just a guy that does the normal amount of dicking around you'd expect a guy of that age to do. Seriously, Jason Mewes just does great work in this movie. This is probably the best performance I've seen him give outside of the movie Bottoms Up. Which, Bottoms Up, this is a terrible movie. I cannot stress that enough. This is a bad movie. It has interesting ideas, interesting themes that it tries to tackle, but bad movie. Jason Mewes, though, he's really good in it. Jason Mewes is really good in this movie. And it's also interesting seeing all the fun interactions between him and Carmen Lee's character Cassidy, as the two of them have a genuine chemistry that feels borderline romantic, despite the fact that Cassidy's character in this movie is very clearly supposed to be with Donner. But, that also brings us to Carmen Lee's performance, as Carmen Lee does a great job as the bitch of this film. Like, legitimately. Like, don't get me wrong, her character has layers that you can dig into, but, if you look at the archetype, she's basically just the bitch of the group. And, as shitty as it sounds, I think Carmen Lee does a great job with that. And, she also has pretty good chemistry with the character of Donner, and that probably can be chalked up to the fact that at the time, Carmen Lee was married to Jason Lee. So it's funny that, they play a couple in this movie when they were married in real life at the time. But yeah, all the performances in this movie are great, and all the actors have stellar chemistry with each other. You can really believe that they're supposed to be friends and roommates. And just all the subtle ways that they hang out with each other, enjoy each other's company, but also annoy the hell out of each other. I love it. But, that ultimately brings us to Jason Lee, who is unquestionably the star of this movie. Jason Lee carries this film. Like, Jason Lee doesn't take over Drawing Flies the same way he took over Mallrats. There's still plenty of room for all the other characters, and I'll get, more into that in a bit. But this movie really wouldn't work without Donner's slow descent into madness. And Jason Lee plays it perfectly. He just perfectly embodies a young man who feels like he's going nowhere in his life. And just the sheer level of desperation that he feels as he's trying to claw his way somewhere else. And, speaking as a young man in my mid to late 20s at this point, who is very unhappy where he is in life. Like, I'm very, very unhappy with my life currently. I found Donner's character to be incredibly relatable, and his descent very sad and disturbing, but also incredibly understandable. And something that really helps to highlight the character of Donner is the cinematography in this film, which is absolutely gorgeous. Like, shockingly good. Like, this film is remarkably well shot, considering how cheap it was to film. Probably the best instance of cinematography in this movie that also helps to, highlight the character of Donner is the initial hallucination scene that he has of Bigfoot. The camera slowly pans as we see, a cheap gorilla suit shrouded in smoke. And, just the blurry depth of field creating an aura of mystery around this hallucination. And it's remarkable because that scene should look silly considering that the actor in the shot is just a guy in a cheap gorilla suit. But it doesn't. Like, the sequence comes off really earnestly. Like, an actual ridiculous sequence, and it was actually intentionally meant to be funny, is the later dream that Donner has in the forest when he's dancing with a guy in a Bigfoot suit and a wig. That's supposed to be funny. But even that scene is remarkably well shot as well. There's also a shot of Donner sitting with Cassidy when they first start going camping, and you see a bunch of flies in the foreground, because drawing flies. And, just the way the camera is composed in that shot, highlighting the aspects of nature while still focusing on the central characters, it's remarkable. And you also see similar instances of the cinematography highlighting both the characters and nature in several other scenes, like when the characters are walking across that rickety bridge, which was a real rickety bridge, and, you just have a steady camera movement going back as the bridge is going back and forth slightly. Very terrifying, and apparently the actors were terrified shooting that scene, and their terror was enhanced even more by the fact that they only had 50 minutes to shoot it. But then there's also, the makeup scene between Jake and Meg, which is a very touching scene between, a loving couple, as you see a bunch of shrubbery and wheat in the foreground, only slightly obscuring our view of them. But the obscurity also helps us to appreciate the shot even more. Like, obviously I've reviewed films in the past with clearly better cinematography than this, but the reason I'm gushing so much over it specifically is because of how cheap the film was relative to how well it was shot. And all those scenes illustrate that. And it's actually funny, because Matt Gissing and Malcolm Ingram both sort of lament the fact that certain scenes in this movie were shot in black and white rather than color, because they think that they did a good job shooting the film, which I agree with. But, as I've said in the past, black and white adds a certain level of depth to a film on an emotional scale. And, you might be asking yourself, well, why are they complaining? Weren't they the ones who decided to shoot the film in black and white? Well, yes and no. So as mentioned, Kevin Smith was a producer on this film, and he was a very hands-on producer. And apparently it was actually his idea to shoot the film in black and white. Ingram and Gissing pushed back on Smith's wants, because their intent with this film was to shoot a comedy, and they were of the opinion that comedies don't work as well in black and white. But Kevin Smith dismantled their argument in pretty short order, because, Clerks was probably the most successful comedy of 1994 relative to its budget, and that was shot in black and white. So yeah, they lost that argument immediately. But while we're on the subject of Clerks, I think it's worth noting how similar Drawing Flies is to Clerks, not just aesthetically but also tonally and narratively. I mean, the aesthetics are obvious. The film is shot in black and white, but not only is it shot in black and white, but also, apparently, Drawing Flies was shot with the exact same camera that Kevin Smith used to shoot Clerks, and it was shot on the same type of film stock. And that reality that the film was shot using those means just further connects it to the Askewniverse. But also, on a narrative level, this film does have kind of a lot of similarities with Clerks. Like during the party sequence near the beginning of the film, I mentioned that there was a scene where Jason Mewes was flirting with Joan Lauren Adams' character, a hippie chick. And during the exchange, he's claiming that he's a band producer. And that whole sequence feels oddly reminiscent of the Berserker scene from Clerks. Not only that, but this was actually something I neglected to mention earlier. During the party sequence, there's actually an extended dialogue between Donner, Cassidy, and a character called Pierre, the dancing man, played by Chris Pastras, a friend of Jason Lee. And during this dialogue sequence, the characters are debating the various legitimacies of the archetypes present in Scooby-Doo. And Pierre's character is arguing specifically that Shaggy, the stoner character, is the icon and role model of Generation X. In the sense that Shaggy is kind of like the slacker. And this whole dialogue sequence feels very reminiscent of the Star Wars arguments that Randall and Dante have in Clerks. And to be fair to Drawing Flies, the initial draft of this film was written in 1991, and even Malcolm Ingram and Matt Gissing acknowledged the fact that they wrote this film before Clerks even came out, and that since Clerks kind of popularized the idea that indie films should make pop culture references, that it felt like they were falling into that, when in reality they came up with the idea beforehand. But regardless of that, it still feels remarkably similar, and I can only imagine that Kevin Smith's influence played some factor in these similarities. Not only that, but the Scooby-Doo argument, specifically that whole sequence, is meant to provoke Donner. Donner being told that Shaggy is the icon of his generation pisses him off, because, I love Scooby-Doo, I love Shaggy, but Shaggy's a loser. He is. He's a stoner, dead-end loser who sits in the back of a van. Similar to Donner and his friends in this movie. And the fact that Pierre is sort of indirectly comparing Shaggy to people like Donner, it just pisses him off and makes him feel even more like his life is going nowhere. And that brings us into the best part of this movie, being the criticisms towards the slacker lifestyle. You see, like I mentioned earlier, Kevin Smith refers to Drawing Flies as sort of like a quasi or spiritual sequel to Mallrats. And that is true in the sense that you have a lot of overlapping cast and crew members. But that's really where the similarities kind of end. Because, and this was actually something I neglected to mention in my Mallrats review, my 98-minute Mallrats review, but Mallrats as a movie is kind of symbolic for Kevin Smith selling out really too early. Like I've said several times before, I love Mallrats. I think it's genuinely a great movie. I think it's Kevin Smith's most underrated movie. But if you compare Mallrats to Kevin Smith's previous film Clerks, it's a really big jump. And if you watch them one after the other, it kind of just feels like the same filmmaker immediately went corporate and tried to capitalize on what he was known for. I don't think Mallrats suffers from that. I think Mallrats is still a great movie, but it's true. But, looking back at Clerks is more of a somber indie buddy comedy. And taking Clerks and comparing it to Drawing Flies feels like a spiritual sequel to Clerks in the sense that it continues on with similar subject matter with a similar melancholic tone. Like, Clerks is overtly a black comedy, and the central focus of the film is on the character of Dante and his refusal to take responsibility of his life and take action. And this is very similar to the character journey of Donner. But what makes it different is that, unlike Dante, who's just stuck with one asshole holding him down, being Randall, Donner's stuck with 4. And while Clerks sort of pokes fun at the slacker lifestyle and doesn't really make any substantive critiques of it until the end of the film, Drawing Flies throughout its entire runtime takes the basic slacker comedy setup and basically spends its entire runtime dismantling it. Because while the film does start off as pretty funny, like I said earlier, it has a very subtle sense of humor, that sense of humor very quickly diminishes as the film begins to feel painfully realistic. And all in all, it just makes Drawing Flies feel like a deconstruction of the slacker comedy. And I know that people don't like hearing that word. I know that deconstruction has become a dirty word associated with basically every single hack filmmaker for the past 15 years. And I know that storytelling tools like deconstruction and subversion have been widely misused and abused by tone-deaf companies like Disney and by spiteful filmmakers like Rian Johnson. But it's true. Drawing Flies deconstructs the slacker narrative. And it actually does it pretty well because it does what any good deconstruction should do. It takes the basic setup of these archetypes and takes time showing how realistically none of them feasibly work in realistic settings. This deconstruction becomes painfully apparent if you actually compare this movie directly to Clerks. You see, Dante's character in Clerks doesn't really have that bad of a life. As we see in the film, he has a comfy place to live and sleep, being his closet. I think his character is actually supposed to live at home, so you can kind of presume that he doesn't really pay rent. He has a cushy and easy job at a convenience store. He gets to hang out with his best friend pretty much every day at work. He has seemingly rows of beautiful women basically throwing themselves at him. And, putting aside all of the bullshit that he goes through in the movie, from his ex-girlfriend's funeral, to the fine that he receives for something he didn't even do, to his other ex-girlfriend f***ing a dead guy. If you take the film back to its setup, the worst thing his character realistically experiences prior to the events of the film is just getting called into work on his day off. And yeah, getting called into work on your day off sucks. Like, I get it. It absolutely sucks. But his life really isn't in shambles. It's just kind of failed to take off. Now you take that and you compare it to the characters in Drawing Flies. All 5 of the roommates in Drawing Flies are complete losers who have nothing going on. They get cut off of welfare. It's very apparent in the film that none of them are making an effort to get jobs. In fact, Cassidy even laughs at the notion when Donner suggests it in the movie. They're too stupid and irresponsible to even throw a party properly. They steal money from each other, and they're $200 behind on last month's rent, and don't even have the money to pay this month's rent. So they're in danger of being evicted. And also, side note, I actually looked into it because I was curious. Apparently, in Vancouver, Canada, in the mid-90s, the average cost of rent for a 3-bedroom apartment was $987 a month. Now, I don't know how many rooms the apartment is supposed to have in this movie, but considering that there's 5 roommates, and of those 5, there's 2 pairs of couples in the group, I think you can assume that it is a 2 to 3 bedroom apartment, because couples of that age would just share a room. So if you're assuming that they pay $987 a month for rent, and they split that 5 ways, that's like $197, which is like 37% of their individual welfare checks, which, as established in this movie, is $530. So these characters are so irresponsible as to waste all their money on drugs, alcohol, and parties, rather than focusing on their essentials and making sure they have a place to live. And that's not just conjecture, they say it in this movie. Like, there's a scene in the movie where Jake is talking to Az about how he would survive on his $530 welfare checks in the past, and Az just said, oh, well, I used to do under-the-table work, working at a hot dog cart, and I would make like $60 a day. And boom, that would just pay for drinks for the night. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, you spend $60 on drinks a night? Like, yeah, drinks are expensive, but they're not that expensive. Like, a 6-pack of Mike's Hard Lemonade now, in 2025, is like $11. And you're paying $60 a night on booze. These characters are just so stupid. And this movie highlights the fact that they're stupid and irresponsible. It doesn't poke fun at it in the funny haha way that Clerks does. The movie distinctly highlights how this style of living is inherently unsustainable, and how all of these characters have essentially screwed themselves over. And if you want any more evidence of the fact that this film heavily critiques the slacker lifestyle, there's literally a scene in this movie with grown men wearing diapers infantilizing themselves. Like, there is no better visual metaphor for the film telling you to grow up than depicting a bunch of grown men in diapers. There really isn't. And also, side note, one of those grown men in diapers is actually Scott Mosier. So that's fun. But yeah, I think Drawing Flies does an incredible job highlighting the character struggles of young people who have really no idea what direction to go in life. And a lot of it also feels incredibly reminiscent of the film Reality Bites, which, explores similar subject matter of, oh, well, we're young adults now and we're out in the real world, what do we do? Amazing film that I would honestly recommend seeing. And funny enough, it was directed by Ben Stiller. It's so crazy. Everyone nowadays is talking about how amazing Ben Stiller is because, he did Severance recently. It's like, oh my god, who knew Ben Stiller could tackle such amazing drama? I did. Because I saw this movie. But yeah, I think that this film has a lot of great attributes from a character study perspective, and it also does great work criticizing and dismantling a very prevalent subculture. But despite the interesting character work and the very earnest criticisms of slacker culture that are applicable, even today, you do have to address the flaws that Drawing Flies does, in fact, have. As mentioned, this was a directorial debut from two separate directors. The two co-directors had no real experience when they were making this film, and despite the fact that they had, a cast and crew on hand that could help guide them through the process of filmmaking, there were still some issues and hurdles that they had to jump over when making this movie. And this film does have some problems that you have to address, narratively at least. The first of which being, wait for it, the fact that Drawing Flies is incredibly drawn out. Come on, throw me a bone here. Give me a break. But no, the pacing in this film stops dead at a certain point. Near the beginning of the film, after they leave the welfare center and go to the party, like I said, the party sequence is the best sequence in the movie. It's entertaining, it's engaging. And, even the opening scene of them at the welfare office, it does an amazing job setting the tone of the film immediately. But, once they get to the forest, the film really just starts to drag. And thank God the film is only like 77 minutes, because if it was any longer, I don't feel like it would work, at all. It's actually quite interesting that the film's narrative is constructed like this and has this distinct pacing issue, because it feels incredibly reminiscent of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, where the film starts off as interesting and exciting. You have this big celebration with characters, and then immediately everything grinds to a halt as our three central characters get stuck in the woods and they start dicking around, dancing around to Oh Children by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. The only difference here is that Drawing Flies doesn't have a part 2 to pick up the slack from part 1. This is the whole movie. And like I said in my synopsis, while the forest scenes are interesting in terms of developing a lot of our characters, it doesn't really do much of intrigue in terms of maintaining your engagement, at least until their camping trip begins to get derailed. And the fact that so much of the movie is just spent with the characters kind of just dicking around, not really doing anything, it makes the plot feel really shallow as a result, even by indie film standards, which is kind of unfortunate. And to be fair to the film, as mentioned, the central theme of this movie is stagnation, and Gissing and Ingram try to highlight that stagnation by having so many extended sequences with the characters, just talking about their lives and experiences and, relating to each other in various ways. So in that sense, it's kind of supposed to feel drawn out, but I don't feel like the intent comes through nearly as well as it should, and this kind of leads to another problem with the movie. So as mentioned, Jason Lee carries this film, and the character of Donner has an incredibly intriguing and relatable struggle in this film, being just searching for meaning and drive in a life that currently has none. He's looking for a new direction to go in his life, and he feels like he's being dragged down by his friends. But the redundant thing is that Donner isn't just being dragged down by his friends in the narrative. It's that his character and his character's story is also being dragged down by his friends in the narrative. You see, despite being the protagonist of the movie, Donner shares more or less equal focus with every other character in the story. And this is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's nice the fact that the film takes time to establish each character and their personalities. We get to know each of these characters a lot, and by the end of the film, it almost feels like we went camping with them. But the fact that so much focus is given to the other four roommates ends up neglecting the impact of Donner's character descent into delirium. Like, outside a handful of conversations that Donner has with the other characters, and the dream sequence that he has of Bigfoot in the woods, it feels like once they get out to the forest, there's really not many dedicated scenes to Donner's character, as focus splits between Cassidy, Meg, and Jake. And Gissing and Ingram even acknowledge this in the film's commentary. Going back to that scene I referenced earlier where Meg is making up Jake, during the commentary, Ingram and Gissing lament the fact that there's so much time spent in this film focusing on the other characters that it almost takes away from Donner's character and his story. And I would agree with that. I think that's true. The simple fact of the matter is that while Donner's character descent is communicated well in this film, because there's so many other characters to juggle, it almost feels like Donner's character gets lost in the mess. It's almost as if you have to sift through the narrative of the film to find the actual narrative through line of the protagonist. And despite being a more observant viewer, I can actually make that claim confidently, because I actually watched this film twice without the commentary tracks in preparation for this review, and it wasn't until my second watch through that I actually noticed all the subtleties with Donner's character and how so many of the scenes and dialogue and interactions that his character had eventually led to his downfall. Because so much of it is just lost with everything else. And by the time you get to the end of the film, while I think the ending is incredibly interesting and interpretable, it doesn't carry the impact that it should because the build-up has been diluted by spread-out focus throughout the narrative. It's almost as if all the pieces of the puzzle were there, and they were put together, but they weren't put together in the right places, which leaves elements of the narrative feeling a bit disjointed and awkward in spite of how natural and authentic most of the film actually feels. And an element of the film that highlights this lack of proper construction is the fact that this is a movie about hunting Bigfoot, and there's really only like 3 or 4 references to Bigfoot in the movie. Like, despite the search for Bigfoot being the driving force of Donner's character in Acts 2 and 3, it doesn't feel like that search is integrated properly into the plot. It almost feels like the Bigfoot element is just an afterthought in the film, which I found out after watching the commentary track it actually was. You see, apparently the original idea that Ingram and Gissing had for the driving force of this film was for Donner not to be visited by a vision of Bigfoot, but for him instead to see a vision of the ghost of Howie Morenz, who was a very popular Canadian hockey player in the 1930s. Apparently, he has a reputation of being like the Canadian version of Babe Ruth. But the idea to have a ghost of Howie Morenz just didn't feel right to Gissing and Ingram, so they spatballed ideas until eventually landing on Bigfoot, and they kept that. And you can really feel the fact that they just kind of slotted Bigfoot into this film. And, to be fair, the film is not supposed to be focused on Bigfoot. The film's focus is on the character struggles and character journey of the various roommates, specifically Donner. But the fact that the search for Bigfoot is supposed to be a driving force for Donner, and it's the reason why he abandoned his old life, it feels like it should be woven more tightly into the narrative, and it just kinda isn't. And you know what, maybe I'm taking it a little too personally, because I was super into cryptids as a kid. Like, when I was younger, I was really into, like, Bigfoot and the Mothman and Yetis and the Loch Ness Monster. Like, all that stuff was my jam. And it's actually really funny because recently I was hanging out in Hollywood with one of my relatives, and him and I hadn't seen each other in, like, 15, 16 years. And it's so funny because while we were hanging out, we were reminiscing about this time when we were, like, 9 years old, and him and I were both arguing over, like, the chupacabra. And it got so heated that we ended up fighting in the parking lot of the Cheesecake Factory. And it was, in fact, a fight. It wasn't just me being wrestled to the ground after I laughed at him too much. It definitely wasn't that. It was a fight. But, point is, I was super into cryptids when I was a kid. And, it's just kind of a bummer that, a movie about, Bigfoot isn't really, about Bigfoot. Yeah, I will say, though, I do appreciate the fact that, all the Bigfoot characters in this movie are just wearing cheap gorilla suits. I love that. It really harkens back to, like, all of the old B movies that just use cheap gorilla suits. Probably the most classic example of a B movie with a guy in a gorilla suit would be, like, Robot Monster. But, you see this in a lot of stuff, obviously. I think probably a more recent example, which is kind of analogous to Drawing Flies, would be the direct-to-video movie Suburban Sasquatch, where it's just a guy in a crappy gorilla suit, like, stalking the suburbs. It's pretty funny. Pretty funny movie. But yeah, no, like, it's just kind of disappointing. Like, Drawing Flies has a little bit of everything, but not everything works as well as it should. But, still, regardless of that, I really like this movie. And for a first-time outing from two very green directors, I think it's astounding that this film does come out mostly as coherent. It really felt like Ingram and Gissing were mostly in sync on this production creatively, and you can feel that. And, hearing about all the struggles that they had to go through to make this movie, the fact that they had to live in the warehouse that they rented for the party sequences, the fact that they did most of the night shooting in the forest at 3 a.m. when it was freezing, the fact that so much of the movie had so many instances of guerrilla filmmaking, pun intended. Yeah, it's something I can really appreciate, even if it is a little out of skew. And yeah, that's a joke to a line that Jake says in this movie, everything's a little out of skew, which I'm convinced that's a reference to the fact that this movie was produced by View Askew Productions. But yeah, bottom line, Drawing Flies, I think that this is an interesting film. I think it's a film worth watching. It's not a film that demands a lot from you. Like I said, it's only 77 minutes. And despite some pacing issues and focus issues, I think that this film ultimately does do a great job highlighting the inherently unsustainable lifestyles of young people living dead-end lives. Just trapped on welfare with no real job prospects and nowhere to go. And while I wouldn't consider Drawing Flies to be one of my favorites, in some ways, I do actually like it more than something like Clerks, which is one of my favorite films. Simply because Drawing Flies does have a more earnest and realistic depiction of what it's like to be a struggling guy in your 20s. I'm at a point in my life where I find that incredibly relatable. And watching this sort of film helps to remind me that, I have places that I need to go, and I feel glad that I'm taking the steps to get to where I need to be. I just hope that the steps I take aren't ultimately into a Sasquatch den. But yeah, that was my review of Drawing Flies, or as Kevin Smith puts it, the uncut cock of movies. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. And I will see you later. It's not me making the sound, it's the mask! It's the mask! Okay, I'm putting this in the tag because it's something I wanted to touch on briefly, but it's kind of an extraneous detail and didn't really fit in the main arguments I made in my review. But this is the official poster for Drawing Flies. I actually think that this is a quite interesting poster. It really highlights the Bigfoot element of the movie, which, isn't integrated in properly, but you have the Polaroid photos, you have the side profile of Jason Lee, and you have two images of Bigfoot in the classic Patterson walk pose, the classic Patterson walk position, which they actually reference in this film. During the scene when Jason Lee sees Bigfoot for the first time, he does the Patterson walk pose when he walks out the room. But let me illustrate something for you. The poster is in color. This movie is in black and white. It's a color poster. And I know that's not out of the ordinary, especially with like a lot of older films, like films that came out like pre-1960. Like, a lot of classic Universal Monster posters, for instance, they were in color despite the fact that the movies were in black and white. But, this movie came out in the 90s, and it feels like more modern films that are intentionally shot in black and white do intentionally match their posters to that aesthetic. I mean, there's exceptions, obviously, but like Clerks came out 2 years before this, and it's a black and white poster. The only color on the poster is the logo of the movie. Same thing with Tim Burton's Ed Wood or Robert Eggers' The White House. Black and white posters with maybe a touch of color here and there. It's just something weird that I noticed. The fact that Drawing Flies poster is in color when the movie's not. I know it's not a big deal, I just want to bring it up. I don't know.